Welcome to the podcast where together, every Monday, we explore hospitality in its very broadest sense. From culture and cooking, cocktails and coffee, nutrition and farming, politics and animal welfare, organic and sustainability, family and business, entrepreneurship, and much, much more. Come and learn with me, Mark Cribb, about where our food and our drink comes from, and the businesses and, more importantly, the human beings that thrive on where we decide to spend our time and our money. Sign up to our weekly newsletter at humansofhospitality.co.uk and hit subscribe on your podcast player of choice. Welcome to this week's show, and released to the world on rather an exciting day when indoor hospitality is reopening across the country in England and Wales and Scotland. Sorry, I'm not fully up to speed with where you're at, since I think you could perhaps already sell some stuff indoors until 8 p.m. But the point being, it is a good news day in general, and finally, hopefully, we can find a way for the awesome hospitality industry to trade out of its current mess. So it felt like good timing to have a chat with today's guest, Stefan Leser. Now, a bit different to my normal guests on this podcast, since Stefan is actually based in Hong Kong, and rather than being a little local independent, Langham Hospitality has some big backers and a number of properties spread throughout the globe. However, it is that global perspective that I was really keen to explore with Stefan. There are some really interesting things that we can learn from people like Stefan who are operating across countries and across borders. And I wanted to understand how different markets across the globe are performing, and whether that performance is due to governments taking a different approach on how to manage COVID. And we recorded this show a few weeks ago, but at the time, Stefan's hotels across China, Australia and New Zealand were actually trading pretty well, whilst London obviously was closed. And where his hotels were doing okay, they were aimed at the domestic market only. Many of these countries closed their borders fully very early on in the pandemic, and as a result, they seem to have kept variants at bay. Now, whilst being sympathetic to airlines and those in the international market, I get the general sense from many people that I'm speaking with that a summer of domestic trade only would be way better than heading into yet another lockdown. Certainly with the so-called Indian variant now hitting the news, what should we be learning by looking at other countries and seeing how they are managing the situation? Stefan may help broaden our perspectives with his views. And then there is also how the product of hospitality is evolving and changing globally, as well as the customer and their expectation. What does it look like when your customer changes from international to national in city hotels, and what do you need to change? We explore all of this and much more as we join Stefan very high up in a Hong Kong high-rise. And much as I miss recording these conversations face-to-face, the ability to hop across the globe in just a few seconds is obviously pretty cool. And remember, if you enjoy this podcast, please give it a review and subscribe on your podcast player of choice. More reviews and more subscribers means more listeners, which means I can keep attracting fascinating guests for us all to enjoy. Okay, I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks. Stefan Leser, CEO of Langham Hospitality, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Really excited to get to have a conversation with you, and particularly excited because I understand you are actually in Hong Kong. So you can just say, where in the world are you? At the office or are you at home, Stefan?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, for having me. I actually took the decision to go home and record this one with you in more quiet setting. So I'm on the 45th floor of a typical Hong Kong high-rise building, and it's a beautiful day.
Wow, that's pretty cool, because it sounds literally like you're about 2 foot from me, but are you sure? You're definitely in Hong Kong, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I believe you. So, what time is it there? How's your day been, I suppose? What does a typical day look like when you're the CEO of a global hotel and hospitality company? You're navigating a pandemic, and you happen to be in Hong Kong. What does your typical day look like? How's your day been today?
Day was it typical? I guess it was typical. We start with whatever time zones are ready to do any conversations with me. Usually, either in the morning, I have early morning for me, late evening calls for the US East Coast, or some early afternoon calls for our colleagues on the West Coast in the US. And you have to keep in mind that they're almost a day behind you. And then our colleagues in Auckland and Sydney, they are a little bit ahead of us. And then how does a typical day look like? Well, a lot of talking. I just said it to my wife that when you come home, you're a lot of times you're simply out of words, right? And you're listening to what's going on. You sit in review meetings, and that's predominantly it.
Has that changed a lot as a result of COVID, or was it always lots of phone calls, lots of talking?
It has changed because usually there was about a 50% amount of traveling where you were trying to be with colleagues and trying to see actually what's going on and experience firsthand, have the ability to engage with the colleagues and understand some things a lot better when you see them and when you feel them. And because of the travel restrictions, more so the burdens because of the quarantine requirements, that's almost impossible. Whenever I come back to Hong Kong, I need to do a 3 weeks mandatory hotel quarantine. And so that's not really practical to do any travel.
Can you stay in one of your hotels for that?
Nope. You have to be you have to be in a government approved hotel, and that's only quarantine business. And then you check in, you basically go to the room, and then nobody enters the room for 3 weeks. And There are quite some interesting experiences that come about when you do that.
How many times have you had to do that?
A couple of times. And before that, we had quarantine at home. That was 2 weeks. So in total, I think I've done last week 9, 10, 11 weeks of quarantine.
So people used to pay a lot of money to go on these sort of silent retreats, didn't they? Where you wouldn't speak for 3 weeks. I guess you can at least make phone. But how does it feel sat in a room for 3 weeks? You literally can't leave the room, whatever.
You literally can't leave the room, and nobody enters the room either. So you will get towels every 4 days and new bed sheets every 7, and you do your own beds. And the biggest challenge actually I spent it with my wife, and the biggest challenge for us was actually that dust piles up after a certain period of time, and that's something that the rest, I think it's a mental exercise. You have to accept that that's just a fact.
I'd really struggle.
Then you get into certain rhythms. You will get food delivered, and you eat when they deliver the food, not because then it's warm, and you want to eat it when it's warm.
Yeah. I'm sort of thinking that maybe when my kids were a lot younger, I would probably have paid quite a lot of money to go away for 3 weeks and just sit in a room on my own and not talk to anyone. But now I would be climbing the walls. I'm not cut out for that.
Yeah, it definitely saves a long commute, right? That's clear. You get up and you need to discipline yourself that you're properly in shape when you join video conferences.
Yeah. Well, thank goodness for the internet, because without that, you really would be you'd be stuck.
Yeah, you're working. There is not much of a difference working from that hotel room than working from your office, because the social distancing or work from home. We even have that in place in Hong Kong, and the colleagues sit in the office with masks. And we're very disciplined when it comes to that.
Do you miss the travel?
I miss the traveling incredibly, because it is what our industry is all about, right? Having the ability to experience those different cultures, working with all those different cultures, seeing what my colleagues are able to do and deliver, and how they excite our guests, and I think nothing beats the real experience and the real feel of sitting in the California sun, or walking around in London, around where the Langham London is, or being in Sydney, and I think that's a privilege of us working in that industry. And if that component's gone, it is obviously a lot harder than maybe for other people that are impacted differently through that pandemic.
Yeah, I think you're right. Okay, well, we'll come on to that a little bit more. So for those people listening, though, who don't know Langham Hospitality, can you give us a quick overview? I've read a few different numbers as to how many hotels you have. Presumably that's due to a sort of a recent period of growth. You've also got hotels in some of the world's greatest cities. Can you paint a little picture in terms of scale, venues, how many people you employ, how many rooms you have, locations, and stuff like that?
Yeah, the Langham Hospitality Group has two brands that are basically that we operate. The first one is the Langham brand, originating in the from the Langham London, opened up in 1865, was the first Grand Hotel in Europe, actually, and with a lot of unique features. And then when our ownership group here, the Great Eagle Group out of Hong Kong, acquired not only that hotel, but at one point in time decided to take that brand basically globally. A little bit what Raffles has done. And if you take another example where you take one brand and expand it, or one hotel and expand the brand around the globe. We have, and that's where the difference comes in operations. We have about 24 hotels, and then there are some in pre-opening and in construction stage. We're operating another brand, which is the Cordis brand, that is a little bit positioned differently, which is what we would call approachable luxury. So in the 5-star segment, but more competing with the Grand Hyatts, the Intercontinentals, where the Langham competes with the Mandarin Oriental, the Peninsulas, the Four Seasons, the top luxury set from a positionings perspective. We're an owner operator, so a lot of the hotels that we're operating, pretty much all of the hotels that we're operating, especially outside of China, the group owns. And starting from Auckland in the far west over to Sydney, Melbourne, then a lot of locations in mainland China, Hong Kong. We're opening up in Jakarta in July this year, on to London, and continuing over to North America, where we are in Boston, New York, Chicago, LA, and building in San Francisco.
Amazing. It's a pretty awesome. Have you been to all of them?
Have I been to all of them? I've been to almost all of them. Put it that way. There are some trips that were scheduled and that were unfortunately not able to be completed. I haven't been to our hotel in Auckland, and I'm not so sure whether I will be able to go into New Zealand in 2021, which is a pity because that's one of the things that I would very much look forward to. And then there are a couple of places in China where I haven't been yet.
Okay, wow, that's pretty impressive. Though you've been to a huge amount because you've not been in the role that long. How long ago
3
was it you
years
joined?
in May.
3 years. You must have done a lot of travel in those 3 years.
I've done a lot of traveling, but as I said, the last year, so basically I had to do the travel in a year and a half, a little over a year and a half, because that's when literally then we were confronted with some of those headwinds.
Yeah, even more impressive. Which is your favorite?
That's a good question. I think they all have a very different charm to me, and I like Sydney because Sydney as a city is just fantastic, and I love the mood and the atmosphere. Then I like the location where we are. We're literally next to the Harbour Bridge, a little bit above the Harbour Bridge on the rocks, and then you can walk down, see the Opera House, and the hotel is a small one with about not even 100 rooms, and has a very much a home away from home feel to me. Then I would call it the mothership in London is always an amazing experience just when you get there, from the doorman and just entering that place that has so much history and has experienced so many things over the times. And then there is one that gives me very particular emotions. That's our Langham in New York, which is right opposite from the Empire State Building. And when you, as a non-American, go in there, and basically then the right music is played when you enter the room and you see the Empire State Building, that gives me goosebumps every time I do that.
Yeah, it gives me goosebumps just hearing about it. That's amazing. I'm impressed you answered. Actually, I thought it might be like asking, which is your favourite child, Stefan. I wasn't sure whether you would, whether you'd be able to admit. But well done.
Yeah, but look, it doesn't mean that those are the best places, or it's just the ones where you say, I like them, and not that I don't like the other children as you referred to either. But I think there are always connections around it. I could have said Pasadena as well, but as I said, there is this California sunlight. That is a very particular spirit that is there, and the setting is amazing. So yeah, I could have talked for a lot more, but those were the three that immediately come to my mind.
I could listen, I think. I've literally, the imagination's great, isn't it? Because I haven't been back to Sydney for a long time, and I went to New York for my wife's birthday. But yeah, as you were talking through those cities, I was sort of, imagining them in my head, even more so than I probably normally would as a result, like you say, of a year of non-travel. So are these all pretty much city hotels? Are any of them country, or are you all based in city centres?
The one that I would say is a little bit of a resort-ish character, but it's also in an urban setting. That's the one in Pasadena. You can call it LA, but it is, LA really has a very, now a revitalized city center, but it's a very much in the area grown city. And we sit on an enormous amount of space there with a very traditional 100-year-old building, looks like a grand castle, and this is a resortish type character. The rest are all pretty much city center hotels. It's one of the challenges that we will face in the near future, that we have to find the right resorts and that fit the brand and that help us to grow into that segment.
Yeah, well, that's kind of one of the reasons that I wanted to chat. Actually, sort of conscious of you being city, and regular listeners will appreciate that with such a big business and deep pockets, you're pretty unusual as a type of guest for this podcast, since I generally focus on the smaller independent sector. But I've been looking forward to chatting to you, since with that sort of global business, you've got a number of unique perspectives that I really want to explore. Partly around the pandemic response and management across the world, because you've got to be global to sort of witness that, as you have, I'm sure. But also the sort of the cultural differences, I guess, from a business perspective around the world. But we'll start with that pandemic perspective, because I guess so many of your hotels are in China. I'm presuming that meant that you had a really sort of a real world early warning as to what was going to happen globally, as far back as maybe January last year. What did you witness in those early days in China, and did that give you a sort of a unique opportunity to quickly roll out globally? Did you sort of see it coming pretty strongly? Because we certainly didn't in Europe.
We obviously had a very early warning. If it was a warning, I don't know, but let me maybe tell the story in the following way. I went back from work on the 22nd of January in 2020 and noticed in Hong Kong that suddenly about 20% of the population was wearing a mask. And during the winter, you will see 1% to 2% of people wearing a mask just to protecting the others because they don't feel well. And that's just the muscle memory, the culture here in Asia, that you do that. And so on that 22nd of January, it was, a jump in that discipline. The next day, it was about 50% of the people. And then on the 24th of January, which was in 2020, the Chinese New Year Day, everybody was wearing a mask. So you knew exactly, well, something's going on. I, on that day, flew actually what was supposed to be a vacation to Bali, and landed there. Was pretty normal, but then it really hit us. I mean, the restrictions came in China. You could see that regional governments were trying to make not the same mistake that maybe the province where the Wuhan outbreak is in was blamed for after, and that all those regional governors were basically trying to quickly make sure that nothing's happening. And the hotels were literally closed or empty relatively quickly. So we were very quickly exposed to this has serious and significant business impact. The rest of the world, as you rightly said, not really was having that conversation, was understanding that there is something going on in China. We here in Hong Kong felt it also, because when the border closed here to mainland, then we have a significant drop in business. I was then, when I came back from Bali, flying on the 14th of February to the US for attending some meetings. That was all okay. And we had even business reviews then about the North American properties as well as London. And we were looking at best ever January, February for the company. And in the end of February, I had hosted a lunch with some very important business partners for us in New York. And there were travel agents in there, and they basically said, look, yeah, the phone's not ringing anymore. And then I flew over to London, and literally the week after, I would think about the 6th or 7th of March, was when everything fell apart in the rest of the world. Pacific was a little earlier. And going back to your question, yes, we learned from what we implemented and what we had to implement relatively quickly in terms of hygiene, standard operating procedure adjustments, and all those kind of things. And we had the opportunity to basically learn about that and roll that out around our still very small portfolio. You said we're a big company. I mean, we're maybe bigger than a one hotel entity, but we're not a huge company. We're still small enough that I know and talk to every GM and understand what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay. And then did that, I suppose the flip side of that, as well as seeing maybe the early warning of it coming, you must have witnessed a very different way that it was being managed and the speed you were coming out of it. Although I suppose what's happened in China, I guess, is that it's been, it seemed that they really did lock down the borders, and I presume that although they reopened, not to international travel. So has it been a story of domestic travel only in China? And are all of your hotels open at the moment around the world, or are any of them actually closed?
The one in London, as you know, is closed at the moment because there are no hotels allowed to stay open until the 17th of May, as I understand currently. That's
Yep, that's it.
when the business is allowed to resume, and all the rest of the hotels are open. Yes, the response was different in different countries, and that has to do maybe also with what I said earlier, with muscle memory from previous pandemic or outbreak experiences. I mean, here in Hong Kong, SARS in 2002, 2003 was something that was still very much there, and people understood we have to respond quickly and quite disciplined to that. And that's the part that whenever I talk to colleagues either in North America or in Australia or in Europe, is that in Hong Kong we never had closed retail shops. We never really had closed restaurants. I think the restaurants were closed for one day. Yes, the bars are closed, and karaoke and some of those kind of things, but the life feels relatively normal. We had restrictions sometimes with opening hours. When we had what we would call waves here, and the opening hours were restricted till maybe 6 o'clock in the evening. Now we're back to 10 o'clock at night. It's not the normal way, but the city feels relatively normal, but everybody's wearing a mask.
That's interesting, isn't it? That it's so different. How is it possible? And I suppose this is, sort of one of my questions, I guess, is how much of this is that the different way that governments are handling the situation, and how much of it is different ways that the residents and the population just handle it. I suppose we have this stereotype, I guess, of the West just not being, particularly good at being compliant, whether that's compliant with government directive or just maybe just compliant as a species, I suppose, even as self-motivated. Is it as simple as that, or what else is going on? How can it be possible that in some part of the world you can open the restaurants and COVID isn't as much of a challenge, but in another part you've got to shut the restaurants for what now? I don't know, we're on month 3 or something ridiculous over the winter here.
I think it's largely about discipline. I mean, if look, I'm European, I can speak freely about that and say here the way that people are disciplined and the way it's handled has prevented those major outbreaks from happening. And given the structure of Hong Kong, we are obviously having a huge disadvantage. As I said, I'm in the 45th floor here of a building, and when I look out, there are only high-rise buildings, so the density is obviously a huge disadvantage from that perspective. But still, that's maybe because there is also then the higher alertness or sensitivity about it. We need to be disciplined, otherwise it will grow exponentially and super quickly. Um, and it wasn't so much government measures. It's not what I felt here. That may have been the case in China, but that wasn't really the situation. Where you see pretty harsh measures and where we feel them also then was when you look at New Zealand or Australia. I mean, in Australia, you had lockdowns, you had hard shutdowns to basically get the cases under control, and both of them are islands. And if they keep their borders closed, they know that they pretty much have a strict control over. That's also a little bit the case here in Hong Kong with the very strict control who is allowed to come back to Hong Kong, and then what are the um, quarantine regulation around it. So, look, I think nobody knows what's the right way of dealing with this, but I see very different impacts on our business around the world.
Yeah, that's why I think it's fascinating. So where now are the hotels doing best? Who's performing best?
China.
Yeah.
China, the international traveler is missing, but we're back to, let's say, 60-70% occupancies. We're sometimes full over the weekends. You clearly saw that the first business that came back when people feel safe to travel is leisure driven. Um, then some domestic business travel comes back. We're not big into meetings and incentives and conferences yet, and they're starting to come back as well. But the international border, is still pretty much closed. When we look over to um, the Pacific, New Zealand and Australia are both having a domestic market that's sufficient to keep the businesses afloat. As I would say, they're able to make some money. We're all talking obviously dimensions that are very different to what has happened prior to the pandemic, right? But there is an ability, or there is a volume of business you can work with. North America is coming back. I think there is confidence coming back into the system. Hong Kong, as long as we have those strict quarantine rules in place, we live off our staycation offerings, of the local F&B offerings and those kind of things, but are not having significant amount of occupancy levels. And London, you know best.
So it seems in Europe we seem to have this reluctance. So I suppose I'm interested in North America. Is North America the same? Is that domestic tourism, or is North America still open to
No,
international?
domestic tourism, pretty
Domestic.
much.
So it's all
Yes.
domestic. So we seem
Yes.
to have this reluctance, although I guess we're getting our heads around it. And this seems to be Europe-wide, more challenging on the continent, I suppose, because of the interconnected. But even in the UK, and I can't quite work out why we have this sort of I don't know, this desire, I guess, certainly at a government level, to keep the keep the airports open. But I think certainly as operators, we're kind of like, look, we've been closed now for so long, we would absolutely just take a domestic season. The staycation, as it gets called here in the UK market, looks very appealing. It's kind of like, okay, well, if we can't open international travel, if we're worried about all of these variants, at the very least, let's get the hotels and the restaurants open and make the most of that domestic agenda. Have you got any thoughts, I suppose, on why Europe doesn't seem to be very good at that and doesn't seem to be the trajectory? I appreciate you don't have as many facilities on the continent, but yeah, any thoughts, I suppose, on why we're doing it differently and what we should be doing?
Yeah. Look, I think there might be, and how should I phrase that? I'm not necessarily sure that people look across the borders enough and steal the good ideas that work in other areas and basically apply them in in the way it's needed. Um, then there was, right from the beginning, I think in Europe there was always about the skepticism about the questions initially on masks. Do they work, yes or no? And where we were amazed here in even that those kind of conversations are happening, because the only measures we took was um, sanitizing our hands and wearing masks, and we obviously had it under control through that. So I was like, what's the question? Why are you challenging that in that respect? But there seems to be a strong reluctance to learn from best practices, and then when it comes to our industry, and you've seen that, and I know that you have talked about that as well. I think we don't have a voice at the table, and we don't lobby well enough, and have people with expertise sitting there and say, look, this makes a difference, and not only a difference from an infectiology or whatever the right word is perspective, but also from a business livability perspective, right? What could be done in what way, that you could stay open, we could operate, and still do that in a safe way.
Yeah, it feels a bit of a no-brainer, really, on a very simple level, to just go, look, yes, it's clearly not ideal, but having domestic trade is better than having no trade. And yeah, you're right. We did get involved, and I saw that you were putting your weight behind this idea for a Minister of Hospitality and having a better seat at the table, certainly with the UK government. Do you think that is different? Do you think hospitality at least does it have a better voice at the table in your experience at some other countries? Is it better respected as an industry, or is it pretty much the same approach wherever you go?
I think in countries where tourism plays a major role, we have a voice at the table. But that's the traditional holiday tourism, holiday destination countries you might think of. In other countries, we're not really anywhere close where other industries are. If I look at the car manufacturing industry in Germany, or the financial industry in the UK, I mean, they have a disproportionate amount of weight and lobbying and being heard to the number of people they employ compared to our industry, right? I mean, that the relevance, if my figures are correct, that hospitality employs 3.2 million people in the UK, and representing the third largest private sector, 130 billion pound economy. And but you don't feel that is having the weight in the conversations that it could have and should have, in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed. So what's happening then at the moment, just sort of moving to the future slightly, what are you seeing? Are reservations picking up for this year? I guess the gut feel in the UK at the moment is that we are, I don't know how many days away, 12, 14, 15 days away from the sort of first stage of release, where we can at least open outdoor hospitality. Still a long way before we can open hotels, certainly for overnight stays. But there is this feeling, I guess, that we are going to get a bumper season, even if we look at what happened with COVID last year. The summer wasn't really a problem. We had millions of people, traveling around the country, going to the beaches, and infection rates were very low. Unfortunately, off the back of that, it then sort of spiraled into autumn. But what are you seeing from a reservation perspective? Is globally, I suppose, are reservations looking pretty good for summer? Or, as you mentioned, the fact that places like New Zealand look like they were going to be domestic tourism only for the summer. What's your feel on this, how this summer is going to perform?
I believe that Australia and New Zealand will stay domestic, or will be very bespoke with some bubbles opening up. But I think that's also okay until they have enough vaccination and some sort of herd immunity in their countries, and they don't want to take a risk. I'm in general positive about what will happen. I think the development is quite clear. Leisure will be the first strong demand driver. You and I, without even saying it, both feel the urgency to do something and go someplace, and so there is a pent-up demand volume that will be very, very good for business. I'm quite clear. I'm less clear on the exact timing, and I think that's for everybody the same situation. We're all looking at the third quarter after July, that this will get us back to some sort of normality. There still might be certain bigger events not taking place, but I think there will be enough activity, and there will be a situation where the highest risk groups are protected, and therefore we have to return to some sort of business interaction. I and maybe it's driven by hope, but that's what I firmly believe in.
I think once we've lost hope, that's it. It's really all over, Stefan. So we've got to have hope. But yeah, I guess moving away from the summer, then back into next winter, you've still got hope. Even the winter, you think will be different. Can you see this happening again? Can you see us being, locked down for months on end next winter, or do you think that's unlikely?
I cannot see that. I think by that time we have to have um, enough vaccinations being available that we basically can make it accessible to everybody that needs it. That gives then the trading freedom to the countries that we are operating in. Will that be what will happen around the globe? No, I'm not knowledgeable enough. I think that there will be countries that will not be at the same point. Um, but where we are active, I'm quite hopeful that this will be not happening a year from now.
Good. All right. I'm glad you said that. Otherwise, I'd have to be really depressed and end the conversation, Stefan. So, apart from that sort of pandemic global perspective, I suppose the other one I wanted to look at is culture. So, but because hospitality is both global, but also we're not making widgets at the end of the day. We're actually immersed in this sort of the blended cultures. Often you've got the workforce, which is quite often an international kind of team. Anyway, you've got the people visiting, which is also often international, and then you've got the host country itself. You see this true melting pot of humanity, which is one of the reasons why I so love this industry. But I'm fascinated again by any observations from such a unique perspective as yours. So if we start with the customer sides, do you see anything in different parts of the world? Is there any interesting trends or habits or nuances that have surprised you in different parts of the globe where you think, my goodness, that would never happen in, say, New York or London or Sydney or Chengdu? Is there a uniqueness around that sort of global customer, I suppose?
There are nuances around where you say those are, especially, and maybe let me start with this one. We talked about the domestic nature of the business that we are seeing, right? In some cases, that's even, more regional than domestic, because whether it was in Australia that you were having closed state borders, or here in Hong Kong where you literally have just Hong Kong as a territory that is your customer base. And so we saw that new phenomenon, I would call it, that then got a name called staycations, that were the new kind of businesses that you could actually pick up. And initially, when that idea was coming up to creating those packages that should entice people to stay in a hotel in the city they're living in, I was thinking, why would I need a hotel room with a bed when I have an apartment that's already expensive where I could be, right? So I was not really thinking why that could get so much traction. And so, first mistake, you think you're the customer, which was my mistake. There is obviously a demand out there. And then there is the observation that people come for a very different reason than what we normally host. If you look at those staycation packages, then we were serving Hong Kong to Hong Kongers. So everything changes, because in a normal world, when you go to New York, the hotel is your base to explore the city. Where when a Hong Konger comes to our hotel in Hong Kong, or a New Yorker to our hotel in New York, it's not the base to explore the city. It's basically the base to explore the hotel, to everything that is there, everything that we offer, everything that we have as a dialogue with them and create in terms of opportunities, experiences, and things, which is a very, very different challenge. And one of the things that we had to pivot and learn quite quickly. And we came up with, in some hotels, with up to 18, 20 different packages to create that kind of unique experience reason for staycation. You then have things where you have your teams that need to react relatively quickly to changing rules and regulations. As I mentioned earlier, here in Hong Kong, we had a time where basically the restaurants had to be closed by 6 p.m. Now, you can imagine when you have Valentine's Day's bookings and everybody wants to go out with their loved ones, and then suddenly that option is not on the table. Then you set it up in the rooms. You do in-room dining. You set up bespoke candlelight dinners, and you come into very, very different challenges at that point in time, right? So I think that was one of the experience where we then saw that you can transfer that around the world to create those staycations, but there are different maybe emphases that are picked up. A kids program in Shanghai looks different than a kids program or how we would do it in California. But in general, I would say that the guests behaved pretty similar.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I love this industry is the speed, and you gave some great examples there of something that probably to your lay person, they probably don't put a great deal of thought in it. But I can just imagine the chaos caused by all of a sudden needing to flip all of your restaurant bookings into candlelight dinners for two in
And
the
you
rooms,
know
and the
what the biggest
staffing
challenge was?
implication. Well, I can think of 20, but go on.
But you simply don't have enough in-room dining trolleys.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah,
Things that the sales department might not think about. I said, "Oh, well, let we switch him into," and you're like, "Yeah, and how do we serve them, right? How do we do it?"
yeah.
And I think, look, what I love about our industry is that we have the most stress-resistant people in our industry. They know exactly that they're dealing with uncertainty day in, day out, and they're not afraid of it. They're not afraid of confronting the uncertainty, because that's why what you do when a hotel opens up. You don't know what the issue will be when the next guest comes and walks into your lobby, right? And
It's true.
I think
Yeah.
we're also attracting a certain nature of people and colleagues.
Yeah, no, it's true. We're almost built. We're built for a pandemic. We're used to sort of changing, and that probably slightly
Not that we
overused word.
need it, but I think we're obviously the industry that I think is most stress resistant and able to adapt.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. Yeah, and I come out of this much prouder of our sector than probably going into it, and I already loved it. So how about the different cultures then from a work perspective? Do you find you have to treat people in your teams very differently in different parts of the world? I'm thinking of those sort of cultural nuances or taboos that you need to be aware of when like you say you walk into a hotel in California or maybe in China. Is it a different way that people expect to be treated and managed and courtesy, and how do you navigate that?
Authenticity, in my opinion, is relevant everywhere. And if you treat people direct with respect and be fair and appropriate, I think that's a universal currency, in my opinion. And this is how I behave. I don't see major differences in that. Having said that, you have different. No, the people receive even same sentences in a very different way. Okay, and you need to be aware about communication in terms of what you do when you communicate in a certain way. And this is amazing. This is something that is quite where part of the fascination of our job, and especially of a global role, comes from. But especially in the luxury sector, you have part of the workforce is, as you said, is local, and part of the workforce has an international background, and their CVs show a variety of experiences around the globe. And it's important to mesh those two and make sure that you are true to understand what the local conversation needs to look like, and bring in this creativity and experience and cross-reference experience that the colleagues bring back with them, or bring to these places they might come for the first time. If you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah, and I think you're right. Actually, that authenticity is key, isn't it? And fundamentally, the world's full of good humans. This is the thing that got me into hospitality in the first place, is a couple of years traveling around the world and probably leaving the country, with a lot of, or thinking I knew how the world worked, but coming back and sort of thinking, okay, now it's not about thinking, it's sort of, I know it. And what I fundamentally knew is that people are generally absolutely lovely. And actually, yeah, those cultural differences and those language differences, fundamentally eye contact and a smile and a kind of warm aura and demeanor opens doors, across the globe, in the same way that being the opposite closes doors. And the world's full of beautiful people. But now I sound like a little bit of hippie. So the third bit in that, then I suppose you've got the customers, you've got the team, and the last bit is the government. I suppose the host country. Do you find either the bureaucracy or the red tape, or maybe the opposite, the support and the enthusiasm, do they feel very different in different corners of the world?
The support is very different. In the end, I think all governments showed up and supported our industry. Some of them with schemes where people that have to lose their jobs are supported. Some others where they were basically supporting the either furlough schemes or even paid for people staying employed in that respect. So there were different kinds of contributions, but in the end, the necessity to do something for the industry was recognized. The extents are different, but I think we've seen that around the globe.
Okay, and then just normally, I suppose, out of pandemic time, just on a day-to-day basis, are some cultures much more demanding, I suppose, from a sort of compliance and checks perspective, or actually have we really got a genuine sort of global economy now where it's pretty easy to do business in different sort of continents?
I wouldn't connect the one with the other. I think they're demanding, and rightly so. But it is that when you are an operator that operates around the globe, I mean, you adjust your procedures to a way that you largely comply already with what you do globally, and then you add those additional specifications things to the operations in that specific country, right? A kind of like there is a regional specification for certain things in the US. If you look at just things in terms of data privacy, then yes, there is GDPR, the data privacy laws that apply for Europe, and then you have some California Data Protection Act and other things, and that is the case for other parts of what we do as well. But it's not that completely different. I mean, in the end, we do all the same things, and governments are concerned also about the same things. They might express them in different ways, but I think our responses are pretty much applying to those rules everywhere.
Okay. So let's move a little bit then to the future, I guess. Do you think COVID has changed anything in the luxury hotel market, I guess, specifically? Do you think it's changed anything for good? And I suppose, were there already certain trends and headwinds that were really inevitable in the sector, but perhaps COVID has fast-tracked that change, and you've come out with some positives, maybe faster than you would have done without it?
Let me answer that in two different areas. The first one is, I think it changed the interaction and the communication with our clients, with our guests, and the understanding of that we may need to go back to what some of those places were in its origin. If I go back to the Langham in London, then when it was built in 1865, it was obviously not built for the long-haul travelers coming in from China or North America, right? It was a venue that was there to play part in the local community and host, whether it's celebrations or special occasions. And yes, there was a hospitality, there was an overnight component as well. And I think that's something that we felt right now has regained in relevance, to be really connected with your immediate community and the area that you are in, also being concerned about the livelihood of that community. That's something that I am very much looking to. How do we make sure that that's the case? Because a city if you look at London or other cities, we need to make sure that there is this kind of like liveliness, all those little individual businesses that are out there that make it so enjoyable to walk around, and not just similar shops everywhere and just the big boys basically prevail. And so the importance of taking care of that local environment, that community, and having that conversation with your guests that come from maybe from a closer proximity is something that I think that has changed, and that was a catalyzing event. Just my humble opinion.
I love that. I think it's a great perspective.
The second part, I think, is when you operate, especially when you operate city hotels, and something that people usually don't have at their on top of their mind is that when you open up the door, that door never closes again, and that light never goes out, right? You have a 24-hour, 7 days a week, 365 days a year operation, and you operate usually with pretty high occupancies. If I look at Hong Kong prior to the pandemic, and you run north of 90% occupancies. So the time to take a step back and challenge what you do and the way you do it is never there, because you're fundamentally operationally busy. And this, in that bad experience, if there is one good thing, there was this ability to step back and literally challenging and second guessing, whether it's roles, whether it's procedures, whether it's even offerings for clients, where you say, well, are we doing that? Is it appreciated by the guests, or is it just something that we carry on because it was always done in the same way, whether it's mini bars or the way we do certain things? And even roles, is there an opportunity to create new job profiles that are more exciting, that combine maybe certain roles and jobs together and make it a more exciting workplace?
Does anything spring to mind where you've done that and you've taken that time and you've gone, my goodness, now you've made the decision, it's obvious?
We did take that time, and we took some of those decisions, and we combined certain roles, and now you can say it's about cost saving. And at the time when you operate with low occupancies, there is a component to that, but I also think that we've seen that there is a bigger job satisfaction to that, and the feedback from the colleagues was actually like that. And we combined some of those doorman, bellman, check-in functions, where you say, no, we do it in a different way. And multi-skilling was a topic even before COVID, but now I think that's something that has come through in a larger extent that I would have imagined beforehand.
Yeah. Do you think has COVID created some sort of expansion opportunities? I guess much of the sector perhaps is on its knees a little bit, or some of it perhaps, I don't know, just people making decisions that they want to operate differently. So I guess there's going to be a lot of churn, a lot of movement going on in the sector. Do you have plans to continue to expand at the same sort of pace you were doing so pre-COVID, or is the next stage about rebuilding the company and maybe resetting some of those assessments and roadmaps forwards? And I suppose off the back of that, if you are going to continue to expand, do you want to diversify a little bit more? Does the countryside all of a sudden appeal, as well as the city, so that you spread your risk a little bit more?
The resort component was on our radar beforehand, and this is definitely something we're looking at. Finding the right offering that fits our brands and that actually answers two questions positively is, can we do something to that offering, and is it doing something for us, right? Whether we own it or we operate it for somebody else doesn't really matter in that respect. I think you need to answer that question honestly, and when you're positive about that, then you can move on it. The opportunities definitely arise because, as in any crisis, some people might have overstretched themselves, and now, not to their own fault, they're basically in difficulties, or people maybe say, okay, I want to get out of this industry. It's for me too volatile, too risky, and therefore we have the opportunity to acquire or partner with somebody on some of those hotels and operate them with them, for them, or buy those places and basically operate them then. So I think, yes, there is an opportunity for growth. We're super selective when it comes to what works. And as I said earlier, where do we work? Where do we add value? And we will not look at 100 opportunities and growing that company three, four times. We want to grow with 10, 15, 20 properties over maybe the next 5 to 10 years. And so there is a lot of change happening right now. I would say it that way. People that definitely are aware that we are in the market, and we get some of those requests, and that's exciting.
Yeah, it is. Talking about change, you're very firmly in the luxury hotel market. How do you define luxury, and does that definition of luxury, do you think that's changed?
I don't know whether the definition has changed. For me, it was always, and now the word has obviously become a little bit of a question mark. It was more high touch than high tech. There is the component of the human interaction that is important for luxury hospitality, right? We're not talking about the product as such. I mean, the product, I think, is pretty clear to everyone in terms of what it needs. But then there is the additional, and I would now maybe use the word high care component in terms of how you are there and how you're interacting with the clients. I don't see that much of a change. Initially, there were a lot of conversations about, there will be very different conversations, very different interactions with the clients. It's not what we're seeing in China. As soon as people feel safe to interact with you, it's back to maybe quote unquote normal interaction, or something that you've seen in the past. Will we keep certain improvements or developments from a touchless check-in and those kind of things? Yes, but that's technology evolution that is there anyhow. I think there is the obvious push from the whole world of bringing in the latest technology equipment, whether it's your in-room technology or what we are doing right now. I mean, having conversations over long distances with technology that we haven't used before.
Yeah, I like that high touch, not high tech. So I go on.
Yeah, one additional part is where we are preparing for a trend that might be here to stay, is the hybridness, if that's even a word, of gatherings, of meetings. Having teams that gather in one place and connecting them with either individuals or with teams that are located someplace else when it comes to meeting business. And that's something where we are challenged to set up the proper infrastructure for that, to make those hybrid meetings as smooth as possible and create some excitement around them as well, because you want to have those physical components not completely removed from the interaction of those teams.
Yeah. It's interesting that, isn't it? I think I've seen a lot of that, chatting to hotels in London who are putting in these sort of virtual conference centres. And you're right. Although I think there was a natural resistance, I suppose, because we're all in hospitality, because we love the joy of, getting people around the table and breaking bread and all of the lovely little details that happen. Actually, there is something exciting about the fact that we've now got our heads around it. Like you say, just like you and I having a chat from Hong Kong to Bournemouth, and the different perspectives that brings, just that ability at the press of a button to bring in, different teams, experience and different things around the world. It done well, it could be really exciting. And I suppose the one thing it's forced a lot of us to do, much as we may have a natural dislike to think, I don't want to speak to anybody on a screen, we've all done it so much now. We've probably got the hang of it much better. Even on a personal level for you, presumably your travel, or you're looking forward to getting back into the hotels, and you need to see them. I'm guessing that ease now just to drop in on somebody wherever they are on planet Earth, presumably on a personal level, that's going to be something you use more and is easier for you going forwards, is it?
Absolutely. The biggest challenge is time zones, right? Technology isn't, even for my parents that are in their 80s, it's not an issue anymore. I mean, you simply have the ability to do that, and can do that. Um, I still firmly believe that we as an industry need to make sure that there are components, that there are benefits of having those, what I would call coincidental interactions, that meetings foster creativity when they take place in person rather than everything happens via video conferencing. And there we have to make a good job also providing those opportunities for um, the ones that are having those meeting events with us and when we host them, because I think that's something that the companies will benefit, and they will appreciate if they have somebody that thinks about how they can actually help them do their job in a better way.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the one thing we've all learned as well, actually, is that we do really crave human interaction, and we do crave to face to face. And much as once upon a time somebody said, well, the future is all about, screens and connection. I think a lot of us now have gone, you know what? Yeah, we'll use it as part of our lives, but it's definitely not gonna replace. And talking a little bit about trends, I suppose, and going back to that sort of luxury question, there's a lot going on, around minimalism, I guess, sustainability, environmental footprint, perhaps experience over decadence, all appearing to sort of get more prominence. Do you think the trajectory for the luxury hotel market, is there an impact potentially of that? Does that make it harder to predict, or is there always going to be a demand, but you've just got to work out how to do that in a way that also manages, I suppose, these other perspectives?
There are aspects that we definitely have to have a very good answer, and it's something that was always for us a very important area, and that's the area of sustainability. Our footprint in terms of how do we make sure we are the best possible citizen that we can be on that planet in terms of not only energy wastes, consumption, food waste, and displaying the technology that really helps on that, tackling the typical things like the single-use plastic, which I think has nothing to do with luxury anyhow in the first place, but now finally getting in and making sure you make those changes. And I think there is this positive component to it. When we talk about the whole negative portrayal of travel that was a little bit the case before the pandemic, I hope that people realize how important actually travel is in terms of connecting people and cultures. Because what I experienced was a little bit that the more the walls go up, the less understanding is there anymore, and the more tensions rise between cultures, countries, and I think that's not something that is good, and therefore travel plays, in my eyes, an essential role in fostering really the understanding about what is going on at that end of the world, and therefore, getting to know, going out and experiencing those parts of the world is something that is essential, but doing it in the least necessary impactful way is, in my opinion, something that luxury needs to lead.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah, sometimes you've got to travel the world and see some of it to appreciate how amazing it is, I suppose, and be really, really motivated to protect it. So it's complicated, I guess, but I think hopefully the trajectory is positive, and we're working out ways of there's no point. Well, as we've learned, there's no point all just sitting in our rooms and never going outside for years on end. We'd be very depressed. So we've got to find out a way of embracing the world and culture, but doing it perhaps with a lighter touch. So I just want to close with, then you've worked in hospitality for many years. It sounds like a sector you clearly know a lot about it. You clearly love it for all the right reasons of humanity and culture and change. Would you advise other people thinking of coming into this industry? Would you say yes, it's a great idea? And have you lived in lots of different places as a result of some of your previous roles? I suppose have you lived in lots of places, and any favourites, I suppose, or any particularly great things that you're grateful for as a result of your hospitality journey and adventure?
If you're a positive person, if you have fun in interacting with people, then this is the best place you can work in. I mean, that's in my opinion, clear, because the opportunities are truly global. Whether you work in restaurants or you work in hotels, there are endless opportunities out there. But when I said you have to be, in my eyes, a positive person, if you're not a happy person, and I'm not judging that, but if you need energy to turn up to work and be positive and smile, then that's not the industry for you. If you're a positive person and you bring that energy and enjoy these interactions, then I think this is truly a global industry, because you literally can work today in the Caribbean and tomorrow in Australia and the next year in London, in the city, and you pick those experiences. And the ability to connect with all kind of cultures, all kind of backgrounds, and understanding their perspective on exactly the same thing is a life experience that I would not want to have missed. When I sit here with colleagues and we have lunches or dinners or friends, and at that table are people from Europe, there are people from North America, there are people from India, from Asia, from all places in the world, and all colors, and and it's not even a question. It's not even something that crosses your mind, but you see and get experiences and are exposed to what the world really has to offer. And I think there our industry shines above everybody else.
Yeah, I love that. You've made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up again, Stefan. That's twice. Where is home for you, by the way, Stefan?
Where is home for me? I have a home in Switzerland that eventually will be my home whenever
Okay.
my career ends, and I lived there or I had my home base there for most of my life, and love the country because it has so much to offer. And Europe is a special place because you can travel an hour by plane in any direction, and you're exposed to different cultures, different cuisines, different languages, and which is, well, I think is just fantastic. So eventually I will end up being back in Europe.
Where were you born?
I was born in Bavaria, so I'm actually technically I held, well, not technically, I hold a German passport.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, well travelled. And the reality says that you moved to Hong Kong just as a matter of interest. What's happening in Hong Kong? We see the news, we see some sort of, but not so much now, but we saw the protests with students. We see this sort of huge, I suppose, sweeping reform and changes from China. What's the experience on the ground? It sounded amazing because you can basically go to bars and restaurants from the sound of it. But how is living in Hong Kong the reality compared to your sort of thoughts before going out there, I suppose?
Well, before the protests, I knew Hong Kong from business trips, and living here is an. I mean, it's I think one of the 2-3 cities in the world that is truly always on, and amazing and bustling, and that hasn't changed. When the protests happened, we were obviously asked by our friends in Europe in terms of, are you impacted, and it wasn't really that much of the case, but. I can see that there are certain things changing here, but I'm not into politics and don't really understand in terms of what has been done in the past, and wouldn't want to take a position on that, to be fair, because I don't think that I'm knowledgeable enough. For me, it has been, and for my wife as well, it has been a very, very nice place and a great place to live, and has a lot more to offer than I initially thought. I mean, the hiking, the beaches, the amazing landscape, the cuisine, the ability to eat basically whatever you want, whatever crosses your mind. Uh, I've never lived in a city that is so much about food than Hong Kong. And yeah, it's just fascinating. It's a melting pot that changes within just a couple of streets from one experience to the next.
Yeah, amazing. I've not been. I've travelled quite a lot
You've
through
not
China
been in
and
Hong Kong.
not been. No. Travelled through China a fair bit and travelled through a lot of Southeast Asia and Oz, but yeah, never made it to Hong Kong, and which seems
There
crazy,
is
but I'd love to.
no other place like this. And I've seen a lot of them. There is nothing that compares with Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing.
Yeah. And I think I was watching some ultra. I didn't really appreciate that. You have got some pretty decent sort of countryside and mountains, and like you just mentioned, trekking. So I think we always
Amazing.
imagine the city and the skyscrapes, but you've actually got some pretty amazing countryside, literally on the
You
doorstep of the
can go
city.
by MTR. You can go by what's our underground system and go there, and then you walk and you're at the beach.
I love it. Amazing. All right. Well, look, I need to come out and see you. Either you
We're
come to London and we'll go for a beer,
We'll do both
Stefan.
of that. We'll do
Yeah.
both of that. When we open our bars in London, we have a drink either in the Wigmore or in the Artesian. Very much looking forward to that. And then when you come here, I'll basically give you the Cantonese cuisine experience. We have a 3-star Michelin restaurant here that has enticed me into the Chinese cuisine to a level which I didn't think is possible before.
Wow, that would genuinely be incredible. I can't wait for this podcast to go on the road, Stefan. It's going to be good fun. Any other burning issues? Anything we've not discussed that you particularly wanted to, or are you happy that?
No, I think the one component that is sometimes a little bit overlooked is how much actually, and it's not only us, but I know it about other companies as well. How much our colleagues also went out and about to help their communities, right? Coming up with initiatives to in the beginning to provide masks to doctors and health workers and hospitals next to where we are, to then create care packages and do what they do on a day in day out basis in terms of pastries and deliver them to the first line responders, and that wasn't something that was done for a marketing stunt or whatever. You could see that this is wholeheartedly something that we care. This is our business. We care, and we've done some amazing things in London where we worked with charities and distributed also afternoon tea boxes to what we called the everyday heroes, and I think our industry has played quite a significant role in taking care of also the people that take care of us, and that's something that moves me every time I see the examples, whether it's here in Hong Kong, in London, in Sydney, in all the other places, and the creativity that has been displayed by the teams to also provide venues for the people that cannot do their job at the moment. We had something in Sydney where we created what we called a saloon series, where we invited artists that hadn't the ability to basically perform, and did that for a very selected group of guests. And you could see the smiles on their faces just because they can go back into what they love to do. And so I think that's an important role that we sometimes underestimate, that we play as an industry in terms of taking care of our immediate community, those first line responders, those people that take care of us, and even other industry parts or other professions that are equally impacted from what's happening at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's a really great point. And I think it was Danny Meyer in New York who sort of points out that hospitality is a reflex, basically. If you throw something at somebody, they'll probably duck. And in the same way, most people, genuinely in hospitality for the right reasons, it's literally just a reflex reaction, isn't it? And I think we've proved that and held our heads high. And our natural inclination is to look after
we catch,
other
we
human
don't
beings.
duck.
Yeah,
that's very
true.
clear.
Actually,
No, it is the situation, and I think that's the essence of what hospitality is. And if you have that in your personality, you're in no better area of work than in this one.
Good. All right. Well, that feels like a suitable place to close. Is that the wind, by the way? I hear occasionally in the background there. Is that?
There is wind, yes.
Yeah,
Sorry
it
for
is.
that.
No, not at all. No, I was just checking that you haven't got a ghost and you've not been invaded. But I guess if
No,
you're on
it's
the fifth floor,
wind. It's wind.
just every now and again, I hear a little whistle. But hey, it's cool. It means that you really are in a high-rise
Higher.
block in Hong Kong,
Higher.
and not sat opposite me in my office in Bournemouth. So, look, Stefan, thank you so much for spending the time. Really appreciate it. Really good to get that, very unique perspective. Like you say, you're not a massive business, but you touch lots of different parts and lots of really, some of the best cities in the world. So really interesting. Best of luck coming through the other side. And I'm sure we'll get to meet in person one day. But thank you so much for spending the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So there you have it. Isn't technology cool? Where you are in the world right now, you just listen to me, sat in southern England, and Stefan, sat in Hong Kong, having a conversation like we were sat face to face, enjoying a nice glass of red. Once again, an utter privilege for me to get the chance to chat with Stefan, so thank you to you for listening and giving me the excuse to go off down these various hospitality rabbit holes. And if you are opening a venue or simply excited to go out and eat or drink inside in the warm in your favourite local, best of luck to you, and I hope you have a huge, excited grin on your face. I will be back in 2 weeks' time with a brand new episode, and to make sure you do not miss any, why not sign up for the newsletter at humansofhospitality.co.uk, and then I will send you a quick email when a new show is released. No spam, only I get your address, so it's a pretty easy relationship. Thanks again, and goodbye until next time. Cheers.